The sun was setting over Concord, New Hampshire, casting long shadows across the quiet streets. It was the kind of evening that made everything feel just a bit more alive, like something was about to happen, but you couldn't quite put your finger on it. Karoline Leavitt, a rising star in the political world, stepped out of her office and into the brisk evening air. At 25, she had already made a name for herself as a fierce advocate for conservative values. People either loved her or hated her, and tonight she was about to make waves in a way she hadn't anticipated. But then, a question lingered in the back of her mind. Could she stay in control? She had always prided herself on handling the press, on keeping a cool head no matter how hard they pushed. But today was different. She could feel it. The world had shifted, and in the midst of a high-profile interview with a liberal journalist, she found herself faced with a choice: stand her ground or let them push her too far. The camera clicked on, the stage was set, and what followed would leave everyone talking. It started innocently enough. The conference room buzzed with quiet chatter, a mix of strategists, aides, and the camera crew, all gathered for a scheduled interview. Karoline sat at the head of the polished oak table, her posture straight, a hint of a smile on her lips as she prepared for another round of tough questions. Across from her, Nathaniel Hayes, a seasoned, sharp-tongued journalist from a major liberal network, set up his notes. His reputation was built on challenging political figures, testing their limits. As the interview began, the questions seemed routine. But then, Nathaniel leaned forward, eyes gleaming with a subtle challenge. "Karoline," he said, his voice lowering to a near whisper, "do you ever think about the fact that the policies you champion are hurting the very people you're supposed to protect? That you might be too blind to see the damage you're causing?" The words hit like a slap to the face. Karoline's breath caught, her heart pounding. The tone, the timing. It wasn't just a question, it was an accusation. Her face, which had been calm and collected just moments before, tightened with the weight of the moment. Her team, seated just beyond the cameras, shifted uncomfortably. Her campaign manager, Greg, exchanged a quick, worried glance with her. This was no longer an Naxau interview. This was a personal attack. The walls felt a little closer, the stakes just got higher. And for Karoline, there was no turning back now. Karoline took a deep breath, her eyes narrowing as she met Nathaniel's gaze. The cameras clicked, capturing every second of the charged silence. "Stay calm, stay in control," she reminded herself. She could feel the weight of her team's expectations pressing down on her, their eyes glued to the monitor, waiting for her response. "Well, Nathaniel," she began, her voice steady despite the rush of anger boiling beneath the surface, "I think you're overlooking the bigger picture. Sometimes the right policies aren't the easy ones, but they're necessary." She forced a confident smile, trying to reassert control over the conversation. But Nathaniel wasn't done. He leaned in again, pushing further. "Necessary for whom, Karoline? Your supporters, or the people whose lives are actually being ruined by these decisions?" A flash of frustration crossed her face before she quickly masked it. It was the same tired tactic she'd seen before, twisting words, manipulating narratives. But this time there was something different, something that felt more pointed, more personal. Her hands clenched on the table and she caught herself for a moment, suddenly doubting whether this interview would go the way she planned. What if I've gone too far? What if I'm not ready for this? Her mind raced, but she knew she couldn't show weakness now. Greg shot her a concerned look, but she held his gaze and gave a tiny, reassuring nod. She couldn't afford to lose control, not now. Karoline's mind raced, but as Nathaniel pressed on, something inside her snapped. He wasn't just questioning her policies, he was undermining everything she stood for. And suddenly she realized something that had been lurking just beneath the surface. This interview wasn't about facts or fairness. It was about tearing her down, piece by piece. Nathaniel's voice cut through the tension again. "You've built your career on these ideologies, Karoline, but let's be honest, are you really making a difference? Or are you just playing a game for power and prestige?" Her heart skipped a beat. power and prestige. That was the line that crossed it all. The accusation that she wasn't genuine. That hit too close to home. She'd worked her whole life for this, navigating every challenge with purpose, never backing down from her beliefs. But now Nathaniel was turning her struggle into a mere power play. And that wasn't something she would tolerate. In that moment, something inside her changed. The self-doubt dissolved, replaced by a quiet, burning certainty. She wasn't just fighting for her career, she was fighting for the truth she believed in. The gloves were off. She would not let him get away with this. Without thinking, she leaned forward, her voice cold and sharp. "You've crossed a line, Nathaniel." The words hung in the air like a challenge. The room fell silent, and she knew, right then, nothing would be the same. The room seemed to hold its breath. Karoline's words lingered in the air, heavier than the tension that had been building all evening. Nathaniel blinked, caught off guard, but he wasn't ready to back down. His lips curled into a knowing smile, as if he relished the confrontation. "Oh, did I? And what are you going to do about it, Karoline?" The audience could sense it now. The shift. This wasn't about politics anymore. This was personal. Karoline stood, her chair scraping the floor, the sound sharp like a gunshot in the otherwise hushed room. Every eye was on her, waiting to see how she would respond. She could feel her pulse thumping in her ears, but her resolve was clearer than ever. "You've gone too far," she said, her voice low but unwavering. "I'm here to discuss policies, not play into your little games. If you can't respect that, then this conversation is over." Nathaniel's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second, the first sign of discomfort he'd shown all evening. But before he could recover, Karoline took a step back, signaling to the crew. "Cut the feed," she ordered, her voice unyielding. The room fell silent, the camera lights dimming as Nathaniel's stunned expression met the eyes of the crew, her team, and her supporters. Karoline had made her stand. There was no turning back now. The room was still, the hum of the cameras gone, but the weight of the moment was unmistakable. Karoline stood tall, her chest rising and falling with controlled breaths, her heart still racing. The silence felt louder than any question Nathaniel could have asked. Nathaniel sat frozen, his microphone still clipped to his jacket, his usual composure shattered. But Karoline didn't wait for him to recover. She turned to her team, who were staring at her in stunned admiration. Greg gave her a small nod, his face filled with pride. Her decision to shut down the interview was bold, but it was right. The moment she had feared, the moment of self-doubt, had passed, and in its place was the clarity of purpose. Outside the studio, the news stations buzzed with the story of the interview. Some criticized her for walking away, calling it a failure, diplomacy. Others hailed her for standing firm. Karoline didn't care about the headlines. She'd learned something more important. You can't always control the narrative, but you can control your response. Later that evening, as she looked out over the city skyline from her office window, Karoline smiled. She had taken the first step in defining her own path, and nothing would ever be the same again. Sometimes standing your ground is the only way to keep moving forward.